crowd didn't fall silent because of pity. They fell silent because no one expected him to speak. The wind scraped across the frozen dirt of Copperwood's main square like it wanted to erase everything in its path. Boots, broken pride, forgotten names. Winter in Montana had a way of hollowing out a town, and on that morning in 1887 even the snow seemed to flinch at the cruelty hanging under the auction tent. Clara Bellamy limped into view like a shadow with bones. 25, maybe, though hardship made it hard to tell. Her brown hair was pinned back with care, but the soot and snow had long since stolen its sheen. Her left leg dragged stiffly behind her, wrapped in a makeshift splint tied with leather cord. She didn't raise her eyes. She didn't need to. The sound of men's laughter was familiar enough. "Ain't nobody paying more than a dime for that crooked twig," someone called out. "She'll trip on her own shadow," another jeered. They laughed not kindly, not like people, like wolves in coats pretending they had jobs and names. The auctioneer shuffled his ledger face, half lost in the collar of his worn jacket. "Clara Bellamy," he announced, voice cracking in the cold. "Sewing skills, domestic labor, starting bid 5 cents. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then came the voice. $2. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It cracked through the laughter like ice-splitting wood. Heads turned. Some scoffed. A few blinked in disbelief. From the back of the crowd stepped a man whose name everyone knew, even if no one dared to say it too loudly. Henry Callahan, tall, broad at the shoulders, but slouched slightly, as if from carrying too many years. He wore a gray duster, lined with wool, and a dark felt hat pulled low over eyes that once used to smile. Not anymore. Not since his wife passed. Not since the orchards on the west side of his property turned wild. Not since he started leaving one place, setting untouched at his table. He walked forward without a second word and handed over 2 silver coins cold from his coat pocket. The auctioneer blinked. "Sold," he mumbled. The crowd murmured as Henry turned toward Clara. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't move closer. He just looked at her, not like a savior, not like a buyer, like a man offering shelter and nothing more. Clara raised her head, not in gratitude and certainly not in hope. Her face was carved in stone, but something in her eyes flickered just for a second. Then she stepped off the platform crutch, thumping once against the packed earth. She followed Henry through the parted crowd, not because she believed in him, but because she'd already been discarded by everyone else. She had nowhere else to go. As they walked, the laughter behind them didn't return. It had turned to something quieter, heavier. Gossip would come later. But for now, the only sound was the steady tap of Clara's crutch and the hush of snowfall beginning again. The Callahan Ranch sat on the edge of Copperwood, its fences bent in places like tired knees. The house was old timber, strong but weary. No children's toys, no curtains in the windows, just smoke rising from the chimney and a door that opened with a quiet creak. Henry said little as he led her down a dim hallway. Her steps echoed unevenly against the wood floor. At the far end, he opened a door to a small room with a narrow bed, a clean basin, and a folded quilt. "This is yours," he said, "nothing more." He didn't linger. He didn't ask questions. He left her standing there in a room that smelled of pine and old soap. That night, Clara didn't sleep much. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, listening to the silence. She was used to noise of people shouting, of being cursed, of her own ragged breath when the pain got bad. But this quiet felt like a room waiting to be filled. In the morning, she woke to find a tin plate on the table bread, a hard-boiled egg, and a chipped cup filled with warm tea. No note, no voice, just food left as though it had appeared on its own. She ate slowly, unsure of what to make of it. Henry was outside by the barn, his breath fogging in the dawn light as he chopped firewood. His coat was dusted with frost. He worked in rhythm, steady and wordless. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her breath matching the slow rise of steam from her cup. She didn't feel safe, but she didn't feel hunted either, and that was more than she'd had in years. Days passed, marked by the scrape of her crutch and the wind tapping against the windows. Henry left food. Clara began cleaning, not because she had to, but because the soot in the fireplace made her cough, and the dust along the shelves annoyed her fingers. She swept with one hand and balanced with the other. She boiled water and wiped down the counters. She mended a curtain and hung it up not for decoration, but because the morning sun hit her eyes too sharply. Outside, children wandered near the fence. They pointed and whispered. One boy shouted, "Hey, limp leg, that man buy you like cattle." A stone hit the porch rail small but sharp. Clara didn't flinch. She turned and kept sweeping. But that night, alone in the small room, her hands trembled around the quilt. The wind howled like it knew her name. Then, out the window, she saw movement. Henry stood by the woodpile again, stacking logs with care. Snow clung to his beard, and he didn't look toward the house. After a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out another blanket. He folded it twice and left it on the top of the stack, then stood still for a long breath before turning and disappearing into the dark. No words, no knocking, just the soft language of doing. Clara stayed at the window long after he left. Her fingers pressed to the glass, and for the first time in a very long while she felt the warmth of something dangerously close to being seen. It wasn't rescue, and it wasn't romance. It was a quiet kind of mercy, and she didn't know yet if it would last. Morning came wrapped in frost, and a silence that Clara no longer found threatening. She rose before the sun, moving carefully on her crutch, each step still stiff but more practiced now. In the kitchen, the plate waited for her again, bread, a boiled egg, and this time a small jar of preserves. She touched it like it might vanish. It hadn't been there yesterday. She didn't ask, and Henry didn't explain. That became their rhythm. Henry would disappear into the fields before dawn. Clara would tend to the house. They passed one another like distant stars, close enough to cast light, but never touching. She didn't ask what he expected of her, and he never imposed anything. Her room remained hers. No lock on the door, but no need for one either. She began to fix what she could slowly. The stove hadn't been used properly in years, so she tested its rusted belly with caution and coaxed heat from its reluctant bones. She kneaded dough using old flour and the last of the yeast she found tucked behind tins of beans. She cleaned out the hearth, hung linens to dry, and even mended one of Henry's worn shirts when she found it draped over a chair. She never told him, but the next morning it was gone, and worn again. Word, of course, traveled faster than wind in Copperwood. Children crept back to the edge of the property. They didn't shout anymore. They stared, watched her hang quilts in the cold light or sweep the porch with her makeshift broom, one arm wrapped tightly around her ribs for balance. "That's the girl he bought," one whispered. "Limping thing. Worth $2, same as a busted mule," said another. A few threw pebbles, not to injure, just to test the silence. Clara never responded. She didn't yell, didn't break. She turned her back and kept working her face set like the side of a cliff. If they wanted a performance, she wouldn't give them one. But that night, after the children's giggles had faded and the sun had gone pale behind the hills, Clara sat by the small window in her room. Wrapped in the thin quilt, she stared out across the frozen field. The moonlight lit everything in silver. She should have felt peace. Instead, she felt hollow. Her mind turned to the auction, to the laughter, to the look on Henry's face, silent, firm, unreadable. Was she a guest? A helper? A ghost standing where his wife once stood? Was this roof over her head an act of charity or just habit? She bit the inside of her cheek, tasting metal, but she did not cry. She hadn't in years. Then she heard it again, wood splitting outside. She rose, crutch tapping quietly across the floor, and looked out into the dark. Henry was there again, stacking firewood beneath her window. His breath formed soft clouds in the cold. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. After setting the last log, he paused, reached into his coat, and pulled out something, another blanket. He laid it gently on top of the stack, and once again he didn't look up, didn't say a word, just left it there like a man who had learned to speak in gestures instead of sound. Clara stood still, her hand pressed to the window pane, and her chest ached not from sorrow but from the confusion of being treated like something that mattered. She cried that night, quiet tears that soaked the edge of her quilt. By the third week, her limp was the same, but her walk had changed. It carried confidence now, not apology. She moved through the house with intention, sweeping before sunrise, boiling herbs for tea, even picking at the tangled weeds behind the barn where a half-dead patch of vegetables clung to life. She noticed Henry's shirts more often now, loose seams missing buttons. She didn't ask if he wanted them fixed. She just fixed them. In the evenings, she stitched by the fire, the flickering orange light catching the calluses on her fingers. One morning, she brought Henry his tea out on the porch. Steam rose from the tin mug in the crisp air. He took it without a word, but something else was waiting on the tray. A flower, tiny wild violet at the tips, probably pulled from the edge of the fence line. No note. Just sitting there beside the cup. He didn't mention it, just nodded once and went back to the fields. Clara stared at the bloom for a long time. Later, she pressed it between the pages of her worn hymn book. That night, she didn't sleep from pain, but from peace. Yet Copperwood hadn't softened. When Clara returned to town for supplies, all heads turned. She felt it before she heard it whispers sticking to her back like burrs. Lost his mind that Callahan, someone muttered by the feed sacks. Might as well have married a ghost, said another. The shopkeeper's wife pretended not to see her. Clara said nothing. But the words didn't fall off her coat, they clung and she carried them home. That night, while peeling potatoes by lantern light, her hands trembled again. Was this kindness, or just another cage? Had she mistaken silence for affection? Was she simply a substitute for someone else, a woman he had loved and buried, and she just the easiest shape to fill the empty space? She nearly packed her few belongings, but something made her stop. Henry stepped through the door smelling of hay frost and wood smoke. His face was worn, and his shoulders sagged from the cold. He glanced at the stew simmering on the stove, the clean tablecloth she had laid out, and the fire she had kept burning all afternoon. He didn't sit immediately, just looked around for a long, heavy moment. Then, quietly, "You work harder than most men I've hired." Then he sat down, pulled the bowl toward him, and ate. The words didn't flutter, they rooted. Clara didn't respond. She simply sat across from him. The fire cracked. The wind shifted. Their eyes met once, and something passed between them. Not romance, not pity, recognition. That night, Clara didn't pack. She didn't cry. She folded the cloth napkin, washed the tin dishes, and closed the door to her room with a sense of steadiness she hadn't known before. She didn't know what would come next, but for once she wasn't afraid of it. The sky over Copperwood burned gold that evening, the last warm sunset before winter took its full grip. Clara stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching as Henry rode out toward the ridge trail. A stray calf had gotten loose again, and he'd taken the black mare to track it before nightfall. She'd told him to wait. The ground was slick with frost, and the trail twisted through a gully where footing could betray even the steadiest horse. But Henry was stubborn, the kind of stubborn that mistook silence for self-preservation. The sun dropped behind the hills. Then the stars crept in. Still no Henry. When the mare stumbled back into the yard alone, sweat-drenched and wild-eyed, Clara didn't scream. She grabbed the lantern, wrapped a shawl over her shoulders, and hitched the wagon. She found him near the split birch tree by the low ridge, face down beneath brittle grass, blood pooling beneath his temple like spilled ink. She whispered his name once. He didn't respond. Her own breath came shallow clouds blooming in the air. With effort that burned her leg to the bone, she dragged him onto the wagon, teeth clenched against pain, his dead weight nearly too much. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Back at the ranch, she boiled water, mashed herbs from jars she'd tucked away months ago. She cleaned the gash at his temple, pressed cloths against his ribs where bruises bloomed like dark thunderheads. He moaned in his fever, flinched when she touched him. And once, when she bent close to wipe his brow, he whispered a name. It wasn't hers. It was soft and broken and belonged to a woman buried 10 winters ago. Clara didn't pull back. But she didn't speak again that night either. For 2 days she stayed at his bedside, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his chest. She spooned broth between his lips, sang, sometimes not for him, but for herself, for the silence she had once feared and now held like an old friend. On the 3rd morning, Henry opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was her. Pale, exhausted, a bruise on her shoulder from dragging him in. Her dress was damp at the hem where she'd knelt in snow, and her fingers were raw from tending fire and bandage alike. He blinked, then turned his head. He said nothing, but something between them had shifted. After that, Henry moved quietly, speaking even less than before. He took to the barn when he could walk again, splitting wood like the logs had wronged him. He ate standing. When Clara handed him his tea, he nodded without meeting her eyes. The silence that returned was not gentle. It had weight now. Guilt. Jeremiah Clay, Henry's oldest friend, stopped by one afternoon with a sack of seed and a furrowed brow. He watched Henry struggle with the axe, the bandage still tight around his ribs. "You ought to rest," Jeremiah said. "You're not made of stone." "Restin' makes it worse," Henry replied, breath sharp. Jeremiah squinted. "You always were stubborn. She's a good one, though." Henry's hands stilled. "She's half my age," he muttered as if the admission tasted foul. "What kind of man feels this way?" Jeremiah shrugged. An honest one. What Henry didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Clara stood behind the door, her fingers twisted in her apron, breath caught like a fish in her throat. She had not asked for love. She'd barely let herself believe in kindness. But to be reduced to a symptom of his loneliness, a warm body to ease the ache of grief that cut deeper than the laughter of strangers. That night she packed her few belongings. Her shawl, the hymn book, the pressed flower now brittle between its pages. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply opened the door and stepped into the rain. By the time Henry noticed, she was halfway down the muddy trail toward the tree line, her boots sinking deep into the slush, her crutch tucked beneath one arm. "Clara," he shouted. She didn't stop. He caught up with her at the old gate, one hand gripping his side, breath ragged. "You can't walk out in this," he gasped. "Not like this." She turned to him, soaked through hair plastered to her cheek. "Don't worry. I'm used to being left in the rain." He flinched. "That's not what I meant." Her voice cracked like old wood. "You said I was just loneliness. Too young. that this whatever it is was wrong. Henry's voice dropped low. I said I didn't know what kind of man feels this way, then softer. I never said the feeling was wrong. He paused, hands trembling. If it's wrong to want peace, then let me be wrong one more time in my life. Clara stared at him, and for the first time she saw past the stoicism, past the calloused hands and furrowed brow. She saw a man standing in the cold, not to control her, not to fix her, but because he was scared to let her vanish. Henry reached for her bag and slung it over his own shoulder. Then, without command, he held out his hand. Not to save her, just to say I'm here, if you want to stay. Clara stood motionless, the wind tugging at her hem. Then she placed her hand in his. Later that night, the sky cracked open again. It wasn't snow, not yet. But the chill and the wind carried teeth, and even the horses shuffled uneasily in the barn. Henry rose from his chair, his old revolver in hand. I heard something he said. Clara followed him to the porch. It can wait till morning. I won't take chances, he replied. He stepped into the dark with only a lantern. Clara waited fire, roaring behind her fingers, trembling against the arms of her chair. Then the shot rang out, not far. She bolted barefoot into the yard, breath steaming, heart pounding. Rustlers, 3 of them, had slipped through the broken fence. But Henry had caught them. He'd fought back hard. Blood ran down his temple, and he lay curled near the barn wall, unmoving. Clara didn't hesitate. She dragged him inside, crutch abandoned. Her legs screamed, her shoulders burned, but she moved like the fire was inside her now. Once Henry was safe, she took the old rifle from above the kitchen door, one she had never touched. Out in the dark, the rustlers wrestled with the gate. She raised the rifle, breath ragged. The first shot cracked the valley. The second rang louder, deliberate. She shouted, "The next one won't miss." The men froze, looked at each other, then turned and ran. Clara stood motionless, the rifle trembling in her hands. Snow had not yet fallen, but the wind had changed, and by morning the town would never speak her name the same way again. By midday, the news had already traveled beyond the general store and through every crack in Copperwood's fences. Word spread like prairie fire. The Limping girl ran off rustlers with Henry Callahan's rifle, and she saved his life. One of the men who'd once laughed at the auction stood beside the bullet-riddled barn post, his face slack with disbelief. Heard she dragged him in herself, he muttered. Another replied, sat with him all night too. But inside the ranch house it wasn't legend, it was quiet. Henry lay on the couch near the fire, his face swollen and ribs bandaged tightly. Clara sat in the chair beside him, arms crossed, boots still muddy from the fight, the rifle leaning against the wall within reach. She hadn't slept. Her fingers were blistered a streak of soot across her cheek. When Henry stirred awake, his gaze drifted to her. "You saved my life," he whispered, voice scratchy from pain. Clara blinked, not expecting him to speak. Then he added softer this time. "But you were already part of it before that." He closed his eyes again, and Clara just sat there motionless. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But something inside her settled a root-finding earth. As winter closed its jaws around the valley, Clara became more than a helper. She was the pulse of the ranch. The porch was always swept. The hearth never went cold. Her mending was so precise that Henry once joked his shirts were stronger than they'd ever been before she touched them. They never discussed the rustlers again. Not aloud. Instead, life bent quietly toward them. He repaired broken hinges around the house. She ground herbs for poultices and tea. He carved a small stool for her to sit on while baking. She left a jar of honey beside his morning coffee. And still no declarations were made. Just gestures. Only gestures. Until the day Thomas Ridley showed up. a widower leather worker a few years older than Clara. He approached her at the feed store, hat in hand, eyes polite but determined. "I've got a place near the Riverlands," he said gently. "Heard you weren't married to Callahan. I could offer something, more fitting maybe, closer to your years." Clara looked down at the snow gathered around his boots, at the fine gloves he had made himself. Then she raised her eyes and said only, "I already have a home." Thomas nodded once, respectful, but the words followed her like wood smoke clinging to a coat. She said nothing to Henry that night, but he noticed the quiet in her movements, the way her hands lingered on the kettle, the far-off look in her eyes when she stood at the window too long. A few mornings later, Henry began hauling boards. He didn't explain. He just worked quiet and focused. Hinges were repaired, nails hammered. Clara watched from the porch, puzzled as he disappeared into the north side of the property. Then, one day, he asked her to follow. Beyond the pasture and the dried-up creek bed stood a cabin, old and gray, half forgotten. Once it had been his home before he built the larger house, back when he'd been married. He opened the door. It didn't creak. The hinges were new. Inside, sunlight poured through clean glass panes. A sturdy table sat near the window. Empty shelves waited along the walls. A rocking chair rested beside a small stove. On a chest was a folded blanket, freshly mended. Clara stepped inside, slowly unsure, and then she saw it. On the shelf near the window, one book sat alone, a guide to stitching and homecraft. Cloth bound, worn at the edges. Inside the cover, a name written in fading ink, Rebecca Callahan. She swallowed hard. Henry didn't speak. He stepped beside her and looked straight ahead. "Figured you could use a space of your own," he said. "Warm hands make better seams." Then he left, and when the door closed softly behind him, Clara stood there for a long time. One hand resting on the book's spine, the other brushing a tear from her cheek. He hadn't asked her to stay. He hadn't offered a ring, but he had given her something rarer, a room with her name on it, not carved, but understood. After that, the town started calling her the Quiet Rose of Copperwood. They saw her walking beside Henry to the store, her crutch replaced by a steadier stride. They saw him pull her chair closer to the stove before she sat. Saw her mend his clothes with extra stitching along the seams. Saw him leave wild herbs on the sill in little glass jars labeled with her handwriting. No one said wife. No one asked, "When's the wedding?" That wasn't the kind of story this was. One Sunday, a woman who once scoffed at Clara now tipped her hat. She tamed the mountain in him, she whispered. Another replied, and he gave her roots. No wind can pull. Then came the snowstorm. The sky turned leaden, and the horizon vanished. Henry had gone out to check a leak near the stable, but he was gone too long. When he returned, frost clung to his beard, his hands shaking. Clara met him at the door, scolding beneath her breath. She wrapped him in quilts, pressed warmth into his palms, made tea strong enough to shake the cold from his bones. That night, she sat by the fire knitting with blue-gray wool. Her fingers moved steady a rhythm she didn't even notice. Henry returned from the back room, holding a small flannel-wrapped bundle. He offered it without a word. Inside a scarf, thick, soft, hand-stitched. Etched into one end, carefully burned with his branding iron, were 4 words. "You made me live again." Clara pressed the scarf to her chest, eyes bright in the firelight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached out and laid her hand gently over his. And in that quiet, in that moment, a vow was made without a single word. They hadn't married. There were no papers signed. But from then on, they belonged to each other. Spring came early that year to Copperwood, rolling in on a breeze scented with thawed earth and shy blossoms. The hills shed their icy coats, and patches of green emerged between fence posts still silvered by frost. Birds returned noisier than the townsfolk, filling the air with movement and sound. Behind the barn, where the wild grass had begun to stretch again, Clara Bellamy stood with her hand resting on the back of a black stallion, young, lean, and lame. His name was Ash. Born with a malformed foreleg, he had been left behind when the herd was sold off in the fall. Most men would have put him down, and Henry nearly had. But Clara had stepped between them, steady and sure. "Let me try," she said. "I know how to walk with pain." At first, Ash had flinched from her touch, recoiled from her presence. But Clara was patient. Every morning, before the sun crested the hills, she brought him a handful of oats, sat beside the corral, and read aloud from old books. She sang lullabies she barely remembered learning. She waited. Ash began to come closer. Then he stayed. By early April, Clara mounted him bareback, moving slow and deliberate. Her limp mirrored by his staggered gait, the two of them moved across the field like water, finding a path through stone, awkward, imperfect, but unstoppable. Henry stood on the porch arms, crossed, smiling so wide it carved new lines into his weathered face. That same afternoon, Clara carried a small wooden board to the tree behind the barn and nailed it upright. With a carving knife, she began etching letters into its face. By the end of the week, 3 barefoot children from the edge of Copperwood came each morning, curiosity outweighing caution. Clara welcomed them with crushed charcoal chalk and old blankets laid in the grass. She taught them how to write their names in the dirt, how to listen for the wind in the trees, and what it meant to speak only when you truly had something worth saying. Word traveled again, this time not as gossip, but as wonder. More children came. Clara read from memory, and from the Bible Henry donated. She braided their hair, tied ribbons in it, and gave them flower-pressed bookmarks. They returned home, quieter, brighter. Parents noticed. The quiet girl's teaching now someone whispered at the general store. No longer said with disdain. An old ranch hand added the one Callahan brought back from the dirt. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was a blessing. One afternoon, as Clara loaded a basket of dried poppies and honey-sweet daisies, a knock came at the ranch door. A boy from town handed Henry a folded notice Copperwood was hosting its first-ever Spring Bloom Festival. The committee had asked Clara to bring flowers. She hesitated. "They don't need my flowers," she murmured. Henry looked up from the porch rail he was sanding. "Let them see what blooms where love grows." So she went. At the market, she laid out bundles of lavender jars of wild poppies, tiny bouquets bound in twine. People came not just to buy, but to see her. The woman who once called her a ghost now approached with a cane and eyes soft from time. She bought every bouquet in the basket. "I used to think he paid too much," she said. "Now I think you were priceless." Clara didn't answer. She bowed her head, blinked fast against the sun, and thanked her. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the land, Clara sat quietly near the lavender bush she had planted by the porch. Henry joined her, setting a small wooden box in her lap. Inside was a silver pen, old but elegant. Tarnished at the edges, the engraving still clear. "To the woman who made this house more than a place." Clara looked at him but said nothing. She didn't need to. She wrapped her arms around him and held him tightly, the way he had once steadied her through wind and silence and storm. Nearby, the old wind chime, crafted by Henry from mismatched silver spoons, clinked gently in the breeze. Each spoon a different size. Each one, he had told her once, marked a day she made him smile. That night, children gathered by lantern light on the porch. Clara told them a story not from a book, but from memory. Once she said there was an old man who paid $2 for a girl no one wanted. A child frowned. He bought her. Clara smiled softly. That's the word they used. But he didn't buy her like a thing. He gave her a roof, and she gave him something money couldn't. Did she love him another? Asked wide-eyed. Clara's gaze drifted toward the house glowing warm behind her. No, she answered. She grew love with him. That's better. Inside, the kettle whistled. Outside, the camera might have pulled back if anyone were watching. Past the window, where Henry now carved benches for the children. Past the porch, where Clara hung flowers to dry. Past the rustling poppies planted by hand, one by one. There were no wedding bands, no grand declarations, but every gesture was a vow. Every quiet moment, shared tea, folded quilts, laughter echoing through the meadow was a promise kept. Together, they'd built more than a home. They had built a quiet, enduring kind of forever. Love isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with roses or rings. Sometimes it begins with a broken girl and a quiet man, with shared silences, small kindnesses, and a flower left on a tray. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered through wooden walls and carried on the scent of lavender. They are stitched into mended shirts, carved into porch rails, and taught to barefoot children under wide Montana skies. Let this be your reminder. You are not the sum of what you lack, and kindness, even the quiet kind, can resurrect what the world tried to bury. If this story moved you even a little, tell us below. What's your version of a quiet forever? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of silent strength, enduring love, and unexpected grace. And remember, sometimes the smallest gesture is the loudest act of love.